Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show Carlos from Simple Proof, here to talk about timestamps, to talk about the Bitcoin blockchain and actually elections and the Guatemalan election and securing and timestamps and using Bitcoin and the blockchain to actually show proof and verification of different elections and timestamps and voting. And we get into a lot of things that sound very complicated on the surface. And, people say, I thought Bitcoin was money. Well, it's also a public ledger and does a lot of really cool things that we dive into in this episode that Carlos does a much better job of explaining than I do. So I will let you all dig into that in this episode with Carlos. But we talk about the Guatemalan election recently and how they actually use Simple Proof and timestamps, this open source protocol that utilizes the Bitcoin blockchain to actually verify different results of the election and these forms that election officials use. And we get into all of that in this episode and really cool use cases. And I encourage you all to check out the links actually in the show notes. That there's a short film about this. There's other resources in Simple Proof's website. We talked about what that could look like actually in the US, because Simple Proof is a really, really great concept and design that I think would be really beneficial for a lot of election results and also public documents and officials. There's much more use cases beyond just elections that we get into in this episode. But obviously there's a lot to think about, especially in the US, a lot of the, I would consider post-truth, post-media rhetoric of, can we trust election results? All of these different things. Well, Bitcoin is the ultimate truth in terms of the ledger. So if folks appreciate and want to promote democracy and truth in elections, something like Simple Proof and timestamps is a really good example of how to do that. So also in this episode, if you happen to know election officials, or you want to try to figure out how to get Simple Proof into your local county elections or state elections or federal elections in the US or wherever you are, please reach out to Carlos, reach out to myself if you have more kind of questions or thoughts around this as well. I like to nerd out on this stuff, but Carlos's info is all in the show notes as well. So anyway, before I let you get to the episode, do not forget about our promo links you can take advantage of. SAS mining for 100% renewable mining. You can save $50 on each and every miner. So go to that link in our show notes through SAS mining. And then also Bitbox is the best way to safely and securely hold your Bitcoin private keys. You're going to get 5% off by going to bitbox.swiss/TPB and using TPB in checkout to get 5% off the best Bitcoin hardware wallet. All right, I'll let you guys get to this awesome episode. And as always, if you have any feedback, please reach out to me at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. All right, we'll see you again next week. Enjoy the conversation. Hey, Carlos, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great, Trey. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to have this conversation. A bit of a complicated topic, I would say, especially for maybe there's some new folks listening to our show or other shows. They want to learn about Bitcoin and better money. And then you're like, well, the Bitcoin blockchain can actually be used to verify and help promote and build democracy in elections and better elections and all this stuff. And they're like, wait a minute, what? What are you talking about? So we're going to unpack that in this episode and probably a bit more. But before we jump into that conversation, do you want to let folks know who don't know already who you are and what you do and what we're here to talk about today?
Sure. So my name is Carlos Toriello. I am from Guatemala, which is right after Mexico, for those that don't know, and right before El Salvador. So you may know where El Salvador is now. Well, Guatemala is in between El Salvador and Mexico. And born and raised, was able to go to school in the States, came back to work in the region, and fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole a while ago. And my life's mission is to contribute to the adoption of Bitcoin, particularly in Central America, as much as I possibly can, with whatever ways come up. And I was a volunteer in our voting system, and that kind of was a parallel to my rabbit hole journey, and just increasingly seeing democracy and specifically voting as a unique opportunity to provide an educational touch point for people that have not considered Bitcoin to get exposed to it through different means.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for all of your work. My goodness, that's a lot and super important. And you've been on other podcasts. You've been kind of talking about these things a lot. recently, but I think there's many in our audience that might be hearing this for the first time. So I'm really excited to get into simple proof, to get into timestamps, to get into really, I mean, there's so many different ways you could talk about Bitcoin, but Bitcoin the money and then Bitcoin the blockchain, or as frustratingly people talk about all the time, blockchain. And maybe they don't really know about Bitcoin blockchain, but we're here to still specifically talk about the Bitcoin blockchain in this context. But I wanted to start just by talking about Guatemalan elections, talking about election integrity in general. I think it's a conversation happening all over the world. Obviously, Latin America has had a lot of experience, good and bad, with election integrity. The United States now has had conversations about election integrity for quite some time, really, but it's really become more vocal the past couple of presidential cycles. So every nation around the world likes to focus on and talk about election integrity, even to the point where political parties are saying, we are the party of integrity in this way, and they are not, right? And you hear all of this rhetoric around election integrity. But I want to talk specifically about the Guatemalan context and how this project arose in terms of focusing on election integrity and how Bitcoin fits into that in this context.
For sure. So Guatemala has elections every 4 years and has had them since 1985. That's the last time we had kind of rebooted our democracy. And the way that they're carried about is unique, I think, particularly because it is an organic, voluntary citizen army is what people refer to it here. And so every 4 years, just kind of this spontaneous, rather disorganized and crazy thing happens where citizens around Guatemala are the ones that take control of these voting tables. And they are the ultimate authority at the voting table. Like, they literally become kind of mayors for a day, and their jurisdiction is the table. And their work is to give their neighbors their ballots, and throughout the day, overseen by political party witnesses that can watch everything they do to make sure that there's no funny stuff. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of people are mobilized. And for context, Guatemala has 18 million people, population around 18 million. Of those, there are 9.2 million registered voters. And out of that, usually about in last year, 4.2 million actually bothered to vote. So plenty stay at home, but over 4 million showed up to vote. And they are assigned to these voting tables, which as of last year were about 25,000. And so each voting table has these volunteers and these political party witnesses. Since there's 25,000, it's upwards of 200,000 people. So out of the 4.2 million people that bothered to vote, a good 5% of that total, so 1 in 20 voters, are actually at the voting table handling the votes and protecting the vote. So it's a result of our last revolution in 1982, when we were sick as a nation of having about 30, 40 years of sham elections. And so this unique system was built where the whole point was empower the citizenry as much as possible to handle the vote. And so this idea of the citizen as like the ultimate arbiter of the totals at their table, and that total produces a document, which is kind of the soul of our democracy. And so these documents contain all of these votes, and just the summation of all these is what gets to the national totals. But the coolest thing is, because there's hundreds of thousands of people out there, everyone can see these documents get created, and anyone can take photographs of these and later audit the whole process, right? And so that's what I came into participating in as a member of this citizen army and volunteer, just passionate about contributing whatever way I could, and finding this place where volunteers are welcome and actually required, because if people don't show up, then it's unclear what happens, right? So if democracy isn't supported by these volunteer citizens, nothing happens. And so I joined the ranks in 2011 and 2015 and fell in love with the process, finding a lot of parallels, because voting is essentially a consensus algorithm. And because it's paper-based, in the case of Guatemala, it's all paper ballots. All the counting is on paper. It is a proof of work consensus algorithm. And so I just found a lot of parallels with Bitcoin. And so, that's where the story originates back in 2015 and then gets a little more complicated afterwards.
Yeah. So why don't we, because, we could spend hours in series talking about election history in Guatemala, talking about different factions. I know I'll put it in the show notes as well, the little short film that goes into Simple Proof, that goes into the recent election last year. I believe it was August or October.
June was the first election, and August was the runoff.
Yes, that's right, the runoff in August. And it starts off with people stealing ballot boxes, and you're talking about the citizen army, these people that are literally protecting ballots in some cases, and the integrity. So why don't we bump up a little bit into the literal creation, thinking through the technology of timestamps, and maybe for folks that are very new, let's talk about, okay, there's Bitcoin and then the blockchain and how timestamps work in this case with the ballots that you were talking about, because I think that's an interesting point that even reading through it, I think there's a way to explain it that you would be able to do much better than I would, because
Sure.
there's a lot of technical stuff to get into that could explain it a little bit further, but maybe a 30,000 foot view of how that actually works, incorporating this, integrity into blockchain and strengthening elections and voting.
Sure. And so, blockchain is this, buzzword that's thrown around a bunch. The original word by at least Satoshi in the spirit of Bitcoin was the time chain. And more recently, through some emails, private emails that came out as a result of the Craig Wright case, we know that Satoshi specifically spoke about the timestamping use case of Bitcoin as kind of the only thing he could come up with outside of money, right? So important caveat here for folks is we are talking about a different use case for Bitcoin, which is a timestamping use case that is separate from money. However, it is kind of a byproduct of how the time chain works, where every block is more or less, or on average, 10 minutes, right? And so over time, as the block spaces get smoothed over, because they are usually a 10-minute time interval, you could kind of compare the Bitcoin blockchain or time chain to kind of a clock, right? And so if that is so, then kind of data that we could include on transactions that make their way into these blocks could then be used to reference that data in that moment in time, which is literally what a timestamp is. And timestamping is just anything. And this timestamping predates computers, in that people would in olden times, back in the 20th century, take pictures of themselves with newspapers, for example, so that you could prove that whatever's happening in the picture is at least as old as that newspaper that came out, right? And so the idea of timestamping is useful for many purposes, and it predates computers. But the cool thing about Bitcoin is, because it's the most decentralized network in the world by far, then it is potentially, and I would argue, obviously, the best proof of publication or record that you could use for timestamping purposes. Because whereas, taking a picture of yourself with a newspaper, you could always, potentially argue that newspaper could have issued a special copy for you that they, replicated at some other time. Like if you're using a database of any sort or relying on any piece of information out there to timestamp something, you're relying on whoever emits that information, which is the famous Oracle problem. And so if you're using Bitcoin, though, then once you use a transaction on a block as a timestamp, then there's arguably no way, unless somehow you could reorg the Bitcoin blockchain, which at this point would require a 51% attack, which is potentially impossible, according to other folks that know a lot more about this than I do. But therefore, you can timestamp information to Bitcoin using Bitcoin as your final arbiter of truth. Now, the question would be, why would timestamping be useful? And it is useful for many respects, but say fundamentally, it's if you ever have a need to prove that some kind of data is at least as old as a certain amount of time, then timestamping is incredibly useful. And in the case of elections, actually, it is supremely useful.
I wanted to ask one thing too, and it's because I got into, I've kind of looked into technicalities of timestamping, thought about all of this, but sometimes when you can think into something so much that you read into it a lot and maybe you overcomplicate simple things. So I wanted to get into the importance of timestamping. And in this case, with election integrity, and in this specific use case in Guatemala, it can probably be the same for others. Is it that within that time period, you can arguably say, okay, well, someone, because they again in the short film you had sent over and that I've seen before, obviously a lot can happen between the point of these forms being filled out, the form number 4s, right? The different kind of election ballots and things like that. Between that and then say an hour later or 10 hours later, like things can be kind of changed and altered. Can you talk about how timestamping and something like simple proof plays into that specific timestamp, and what is the problem you're trying to solve in that instance?
For sure. And so with that, kind of just background of, if you can trust that Bitcoin is kind of this clock that everyone has access to, and if you get information on that on the blockchain, on the time chain, then there's really no more trustworthy registry anywhere than what the Bitcoin blockchain says. In our case, in Guatemala, because of these documents that are produced at these voting tables, they're produced on election night by hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously in this decentralized format. What's super important is it's all in paper, yes, and we have paper audits and you can review the paper trail. But as of the late 90s, we started to have this website where all of these documents were scanned at some point in the process and later found themselves on the internet as JPEG files. And that's when things can get really strange and weird quickly, because how do you know that the picture that you're looking at on the internet is the picture that was taken at the voting table? It's actually very difficult problem. And the closest thing that solved it is Bitcoin in terms of solving for the double spend problem. So in our case, it's very obvious because of what happened in 2019. And I do have to provide a little bit more context there, and kind of where this all came about is I was an election auditor in the elections of 2019. So prior to that, I was a part of the Citizen Army, but I was asked to become an auditor for a political party that was running elections. And so I was plugged into the system in 2019. Again, to emphasize, this is 2019. And I was plugged in, and you had expected to see 100,000 JPEGs come into this internet website that I was connected to on the back end. And on election night, instead of seeing that database go from 0 to 100,000, it jumped up and down from 0 to 10 to 5 to 50 to 20 to 100 to 0, then again back to 100 to 0 over the span of 6 days. So something bad was happening. Worst case scenario is literally someone was coming in and changing the files and altering the JPEGs to alter these images to suit their needs. Or, best case scenario is, there was a terrible mistake in the infrastructure of the IT department, and the files just were corrupted or something was happening to the database. But this was the first time that very publicly this collapsed, and 6 days later, they finally were able to revive this database that the media uses to inform the public on who won. And so obviously, since this is 6 days after the fact in 2019, essentially for the first time in over 35 years in Guatemala, there were credible election fraud accusations being made by people on all sides. So this wasn't a left-right issue. This was everyone on the political spectrum was unhappy because they could see with their own eyes the database was, just dropping out, and the media was camera, like looking at like, I don't know what to say. I mean, there were numbers here a moment ago, they're no longer there. I mean, can you imagine what would happen if that happened during an election in the US, right? Like all these feeds that end up getting into CNN, Fox, etc. Like you're relying on a bunch of critical IT systems that if they fail, what happens? Well, that's what happened in 2019. So this wasn't a political issue. It was just a massive, awful problem. And the problem was no one trusted the documents after the fact, right? And so I did a lot of work to push the election authorities to essentially suggest, hey, next time when you publish this to the internet, you should accompany every single file that you're publishing with a timestamp, with some kind of certification to a blockchain, a public database that anyone could review, so that if something happens like this, like what happened in 2019, then at least we have something to compare to on election night, right? So the website can crash for days on end, but if you have timestamps that you can verify to a database like Bitcoin, then you can recreate it and trust that that's the case. And so it's actually probably easier for me to show what happened in 2023 as a result, right? So let me just bring that up 1 second.
Yeah, and if you're listening on Pod Player, I'll describe some of it, but you might want to check out our YouTube as well to be able to see in the screen here.
For sure. So what folks are seeing is trep.gt. It's a website, trep.gt. And so anyone can do this at home. If you're following along, this is the website that the Guatemalan election authorities publishes on election night. So I just click on a button. And so now I can select and toggle between up here the different elections. We not only elected president, but also the legislative, etc. But so I'm toggling the president election. If I move this a bit to the right, then I can see, I can see my map. And so they're like, this is the country of Guatemala. And I can select between voting districts. And then further down, it's saying these are the totals by each political party. So this is the national total for example, this party. And then under it, it's these numbers. But, of course, don't trust, verify. How do I know that these numbers are actually added up? And that's where it's really cool in terms of how transparent our election system is. I can input any number between 1 and 24,500. What's your favorite number, Trey?
You said 24,500?
Indeed.
Let's do 20,000 right on the dot.
So I just put 20,000 into this section called Resultados por Mesa Electoral, which means election table results. And so now instead of looking at the national totals, I'm actually looking at table number 20,000, voting center number 3,096 in the municipality, department, etc. Right? So I just drilled into the very specific voting table that adds up to the national totals. And again, I'm looking at this bar graph, pretty database, like cool database, bro. Nice, very 1990s. And I just keep going down, and I can click this button that says Ver, which brings up the actual JPEG that was produced by that voting table. That should, in theory, be the exact same data that you're looking at on the database that I was showing you, and then the bar graphs. And so here now I see it says table number 20,000 that was signed by Cesar, Gilberto, and Juana. And they're saying 301 citizens showed up, and their votes are distributed amongst all the competing parties in this way, right? And so this is how, the first thing that maybe stands out to people, and what I see as like a corollary to Bitcoin, is this is kind of like a coin join. And it kind of demonstrates how important coin joins are to Bitcoin, because these documents are public, but they aren't sacrificing people's individual rights to their privacy and their individual ballots, because they're mixed in between, in this case, 301 votes. So this document has a public information for anyone to verify, but it protects the individual by mixing him with 301 citizens. And then again, how do I know that this document, we're talking in July of 2024, this election happened in 2023. How do I know that this JPEG is actually the one that was produced on election night? And that's where this orange button that people can see here that says verify hash now takes you to a separate database that's run by Simple Proof, and it's the Immutable Backup Service. And so the madness that happened in 2019 for the election authorities is the reason that they hired this, because people went to jail in 2019 for election-related problems. So all that this does is, yes, previously we're showing you this JPEG is on this one database by this one tech provider, and then this other tech provider is just timestamping this document existed on our database as of 1:19 in the AM on June 26, 2023. Then they include the SHA-256 hash, which, for those that don't know, is a type of encryption that is used by Bitcoin, and the SHA-256 specifically is strong enough right now that it is considered essentially foolproof, right? This code is very unique to this JPEG. Like, there is nothing in the universe that it has this same code. So we tell people
you're not breaking that. There's different metaphors to the universe and atoms. Just for people to know, you're not breaking this.
No, this is as math is on our side, and that's what we use to assign. All right, this JPEG that I showed you previously literally has this hash. We call it kind of the fingerprint. And so this fingerprint is associated with this JPEG. And then you see it was confirmed on block number 795,974. And the timestamp of that block is 1:41 a.m. And so we're seeing that there's a difference between 1:19 and 1:41 of about, 22 minutes, right? And so what Simple Proof is doing through this immutable backup is publishing down here. As you can see, it says source file. You can click on that and bring up the JPEG so that you could compare this visually to the one that I was showing you before. And so you could do a visual comparison, but obviously that's time consuming. Easier would be to just download the file and generate the SHA-256 of that file and compare it to what we're publishing here. So there's a lot of ways to generate SHA-256s. This is, anyone with a laptop can do this for yourself. And then as a complement to the original JPEG, which you can download, you can also see the OTS file. Here, we mentioned timestamp earlier, but there are many ways to timestamp information to Bitcoin. Specifically, what we are using is called the Open Timestamps Protocol, which I highly recommend folks visit this website. It's opentimestamps.org. We can include that if you can later, Trey, in the show notes. Yeah. It's open source. Everyone can use it. It's been out there since 2016, developed by Peter Todd, a rather well-known Bitcoin core developer. So this is all based on open source protocols that interact with Bitcoin. What Simple Proof did is take that to a nation state level in the case of Guatemala. And what this file does is show you, it's the accompanying proof that this file exists on this timestamp to Bitcoin. What I'm showing you here is all the fancy cryptography of the Open Timestamps protocol, which is very hard to follow. However, Simple Proof created this visualization that is much easier, but for the nerds that want to go totally down the rabbit hole, you can do it by visiting opentimestamps.org and recreating this yourself. What we're showing here on the screen is basically this JPEG produced this very unique SHA-256, right? That starts with EC91EB. We can go back and see that is the same SHA that's being published here, EC91EB. So since there's no way to break the SHA-256, all we're doing is using Bitcoin to say this SHA-256 exists in this Merkle tree, which is a series of cryptographic proofs. And visually what you're seeing is it's a part of this tree that is followed by all of these proofs. All of these cryptographic proofs lead all the way up to this final SHA-256 that says 2FE08, right? But this last one is called a Merkle root. So it's at the root of the tree. And so what differentiates the root from the rest of the tree is that we include a transaction ID. And so anyone that's running a Bitcoin node could use this transaction ID and look it up on their node. What we do is we include a mempool.space link, so you can just click on it and it takes you directly to that specific transaction on mempool.space that says on block number 795974, which again, if we go back here, it's the same block that we have on the immutable backup page. That block contains this transaction, which you can see there. And I hope folks have visited the mempool. If not, please do. But when you go all the way down to the inputs, you can click on details. And now I'm going to Control F, paste, and I can see that in the app return space of this transaction, you can find this SHA, which is 2FE08C. Going back to our Merkle root, we see 2FE08C. And so what this means is that this Merkle tree that contains all of these proofs is contained in this transaction that goes all the way back to June 26 at 1:26 a.m. Of Guatemalan time zone from 2023. Therefore, we have mathematical cryptographic proof that this election document can be traced back literally to election night, back over a year ago, empowering an election auditor like myself that wants to verify any kind of all the election results, that I am indeed working with data that hasn't been altered. I'll stop there and see if that makes sense.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, it does. And if it doesn't make sense to everyone, that is okay. It is a lot to sit with, right? Because I think on the surface, what you're saying, and I think you explained it well, is just that chain of proof, this just like security on the Bitcoin blockchain and timestamp. I mean, that's why it's called timestamp. It makes the most sense, that digital fingerprint for securing elections in this case and election integrity. It's very, very, very cool. I think the fact that we don't have this more widespread since that point is still a bit shocking to me. I know there's other ways to think about it and do this. And oftentimes what happens with most things is something has to break catastrophically for something like this to happen. But one other question I wanted to ask specifically, because I think some people might be wondering. So what is the actual process of getting that transaction into the next block? So how does that part work? Because a lot of people here, I don't know if people are thinking this, right? But some people might think, JPEGs on Bitcoin and, all of these different things. That's not exactly what we're talking about here.
Nope.
It's different. These proofs work differently. We don't have to do because our show isn't an overly technical show, but I do like exposing people a little bit to some of the technical side of Bitcoin as they kind of learn and go along this journey. So can you talk to people about the actual mining process and the inclusion of this data into the block and what that means compared to, maybe if they're thinking, okay, all of these certificates are actually JPEGs on the blockchain and all of these different things. So can you touch on that a little bit? Because I'm wondering if some people are maybe thinking that a little bit.
Yes, for sure. I will emphasize that we are
that would
using
be very expensive also.
Yes. It would be ridiculous on many levels. And so we are not talking about putting JPEGs on Bitcoin. We are not talking about generating tokens in order to, use them in some way to, do election, whatever. No. All we are talking about is using the open timestamps protocol, which people, it's funny, it's been around in Bitcoin since 2016, 17. it works beautifully well for individuals. So literally you can go right now to opentimestamps.org and toss in any digital file. Say, for example, you're an artist and you produced some, really cool thing earlier today, audio, video, picture file. You can use opentimestamps.org to chuck in your, art piece, and you just download the proof from it. And it's not that your art piece is going to Bitcoin, it's that the mathematical proof that proves that your file was created as of that moment in time will get onto Bitcoin, right? And the way that it's done is, I showed you that large Merkle tree. What that is showing is that essentially, because the blocks are more or less every 10 minutes, what we did was, and there were hundreds of thousands of documents being generated throughout election night. We just split them into 10-minute intervals. And so if 10,000 JPEGs were created between minute 0 and 10, we grabbed all those 10,000, reduced them to a single SHA, and sent that in a single transaction. In our case, we actually used 4 separate calendars. So we were sending 4 transactions per block, just because we wanted to make sure that we had redundancy. But it's never the full JPEG. It's just the proof. And it's never even just a single JPEG. It's all of the JPEGs that are produced within that time interval. And so, yes, we are using Bitcoin as a database, but we are using Bitcoin in the most efficient way possible, where we can cram a practically infinite amount of data into a single SHA that goes on a single transaction on the op return function, and that's it. And so I encourage folks to visit opentimestamps.org because it's very powerful for individuals. It's kind of tricky and cumbersome for institutions, which is what simpleproof.com is built for. It's making it easy for institutions and governments to adopt this practice that is very useful. But the individuals have been using it in Bitcoin since 2016, and it's incredible. I say Bitcoiners don't agree on much, right? It's basically 21 million as like the hard cap for Bitcoin that we agree on, and open timestamps. Like, I have yet to find a single Bitcoiner that is against the use of open timestamps. So I understand you potentially recoiled when you heard about this because of all of the drama that's been around Bitcoin in the last year. But this is actually, open timestamps, I say is the compromise that emerged in 2016-17 when we last had this, battle over using Bitcoin as a database. So this is kind of already the compromise, and it's just that it's not evenly distributed. People aren't really using it, and we are just very proud to be the first nation-state level adoption of Bitcoin in particularly an elections use case. But to my understanding, it's the only nation-state use of Bitcoin in a timestamping service anywhere in the world. So we are very interested in taking this elsewhere, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is making sure that sensitive data cannot be tampered with after a specific moment in time.
Yeah, and it goes to your name, simple proof. You're also using Bitcoin, the ledger performance, in the most simplest way here. You're so from what I understand too, there's already kind of a because it's not a the word trustless is always an interesting word, I find, because there's always trust somewhere. It's just that, what do you want to trust? Because one of the things that, if I'm not mistaken, that you're trusting here in this situation, but it's a large percentage of the citizenry, as you mentioned, are these election officials, the citizen army, that's actually paper tabulating, right? So you could hypothetically say folks in that room are tabulating incorrectly or writing in what's actually not correct. That is separate from this process. But there are things outside of Bitcoin where, because then you started getting into democracy and voting in general and humans in a room, right? There's some things, with Bitcoin, we're big on don't trust, verify. In some situations, you have to figure out where is the compromise, where is the, okay, let's assume that everyone who is doing this job in this room, in this country, really cares about voting and truth and accuracy. We're just making sure that once that is tabulated, that continues to be the case where it left off from there, that trickery doesn't happen after that point. I think that's exactly what we're talking about here in this instance. that, prior to that, those other questions are not necessarily Bitcoin questions, right? Sometimes they can be other human nature questions or government questions in general. But we're talking about that technical component here, which was really needed for the specific problem that you mentioned in 2019, I'll say.
Exactly. But it's applicable to basically any election anywhere in the world, because it's at some point, unless you're living in some country that I don't know of that is purely paper-based and never touches the internet, and this somehow is still democracy. It's any democracy on election night will produce a ton of data, right? We are agnostic as to how the data is produced. Like, our solution isn't going to solve for garbage being created. So you garbage in, garbage out, right? So there are plenty of things that happen upstream that need to be taken care of, and like you mentioned, that's beyond the purview of what we are talking about. But we believe that perfect should not be the enemy of good, right? Bitcoin is incredibly powerful, and adding this as standard operating procedure for any election anywhere is very obviously a net benefit. And because of our use of open timestamps protocol, it's the cheapest possible way you could use Bitcoin to do this. And so it's also happens to be more competitive than using any other crypto blockchain application. And so our argument is, we use Bitcoin not because we love Bitcoin, even though we do, but because it is the most decentralized, most secure network. So using anything else for something as important as your national voting registry is just nonsensical, because why would you use something that's less secure if the cost is already at its minimum, right? Because we are very efficient in how we're using this. And so as a net benefit, it's all that we are doing is whatever digital data is created on election night, as soon as it gets created, the possibility of tampering it after it's on Bitcoin is eliminated. And in the case of Guatemala, our recent experience in 2019 was horrific, where we can't trust the election outcome because the documents were tampered over a 6-day period. And because something like this didn't exist then, and it wasn't used then there's no way for us to trust the digital data. And so any election anywhere in the world can use this, and we are open to taking inquiries, so please reach out, because we want to take this to an election near you, is what is wrong with timestamping the digital data to Bitcoin and removing the ability of anyone, including the state, which is important to say, it's not, this eliminates the possibility of anyone tampering the data after the fact. Not perfect. Again, this is not perfection. This isn't the panacea to eliminate all election fraud problems, but you are eliminating a big portion, which is like 99% of the attack surface is the day after the election, and not to mention 2 days or 3 days. If you force any would-be attacker to attack the election system on election night, then they have to, take greater risks. And when would-be attackers have to take greater risks, they usually make mistakes, and you can usually catch them. So our argument is this is a net benefit, which in the case of Guatemala was also extremely useful, because the justice system was weaponized against the election outcome, and a very surprised progressive candidate that was chosen the first time in 80 years was, the folks in the outgoing regime tried to repeat the election because they were dissatisfied with the results. And so everyone benefits from having less of an attack surface on digital data. And this is not perfect. It doesn't solve everything, but it does, as a corollary, in the case of Guatemala, create this situation where a lot of people, particularly from the progressive camp, that now see that Bitcoin played a unique role in protecting their election outcome. And so it creates a different touch point to expose a new audience to Bitcoin that's based on truth, right? Bitcoin is the most powerful truth machine in the world. Like, That's just the mathematics and the value of proof of work and why we should defend miners. And exposing that to people that have been exposed to Bitcoin for other reasons, we think is powerful. And it's our way to contribute to the Bitcoin network and saying, look, Bitcoin protects democracy, and it protected Guatemalan democracy, and it's available to protect any democracy in the world, and we're more than happy to help.
Yeah, that's incredible. And that's a really cool point, is that it's a new touch point. And I think every year since Bitcoin's inception, there are new touch points that people create. Maybe it's a new privacy enhancing tool for activists, right? A lot of human rights activists are coming more into the fold the past few years because they're learning of these things. And, in addition to, other crypto they may have played with in the past and things like that. And yeah, the timestamp angle is very, very cool. And I love that story of it's truth. It's one of the few things in this digital world that I've just been trying to learn more and more about since getting into Bitcoin a few years ago. It's a truth record. It is a ledger. And Lynn Alden is one of the people that talks about ledgers, probably the best in terms of money and what that is. But once you understand Bitcoin as this ledger, those other things open up these use cases that are very, very simple, that are not creating other tokens, that are not using other blockchains. Like, we're talking about Bitcoin here. We're talking about the reason it's such good money. One of the biggest reasons is because of proof of work, because of security. Okay, well, that's really cool to see how timestamps are going to be secure in this decentralized database. You don't have to rely on the database of the state of Texas doing an election, or the state of Massachusetts where I am, or the US, this and that. Like these infrastructures, like you mentioned, these digital infrastructures, they have attack vectors. So that leads into my next question. Where to next, right? So I want people to, I'm going to put the link to the like mini film, the documentary, to timestamps. I want people to sit with this concept and this use case. There's a lot of great articles that were written about the election in Guatemala that for people to read into on Bitcoin Magazine and so many other places, using simple proof. So people should really sit with this. Like, we're not going to get to everything in this episode. We could do a whole week series, which would be really cool, about all of this. But where do you see as kind of the next use case? Like, what other types of have there been conversations that you're willing to share or allude to? I think there's a lot of people in the US that have been supportive of Bitcoin, right? Or Bitcoin the money, or maybe Bitcoin because they want to get elected, all of these different things, right? But have there actually been like, okay, we're targeting this municipality? And I mentioned Texas first, actually, because they're a big mining state. I'm sure there might be a city in Texas that would be interested, or the state, right? Like, are you trying to focus on municipalities in Latin America, in the US? Are you trying to focus on federal elections? Where's kind of you're looking to go next with simple proof in this use case? Because I think it's so cool. I think it's just a matter of time. I'm curious to see what groundwork you've been doing.
Sure. So we're very passionate about this, and for a long time we were just focused on the election system. And so as of March of this year, kind of the dust settled, and kind of standing back and realizing, wow, we solved this unique, specific problem that an urgent need that we felt as Guatemalans, and now realizing, well, but this could be applied to essentially all public registries. Like the mission or the vision of Simple Proof is a world where once all governments all over the world, every time that they produce digital data to the public or to individual citizens, as soon as it's produced, it should be timestamped to Bitcoin, because that's the only way to eliminate the state and any individual's ability to change the reality after the fact. And we think that artificial intelligence has, this has been a problem always. Like, it's famously Orwell's dictum. And recently, a great interview by Julian Assange from 2014 started to make its rounds as he finally became free, where he says, proof of publication, and specifically Bitcoin, and why he was interested in it since back in 2014, is the ability to say something that was published existed, right? And so this urge or desire that the powers that be have to kind of rewrite history to tell the story that they want, right? Like, history is written by the winners and not the losers. A clever use of Bitcoin, and specifically what we offer, is any public registry that uses this service, once it publishes that data, it's over, right? There's no ability to change your mind, to changing circumstances, prerogatives, or anything. And so, we started in elections, and in Guatemala, what has happened is we've been approached by other spaces within the government sector in Guatemala because they saw how valuable this was in the case of the elections, where, again, to summarize, is there have been election fraud accusations, and the fact that this was timestamped to Bitcoin is basically the most powerful and clear evidence that's based on cryptography and mathematics as opposed to opinions, right? So the argument against the election fraud accusations in Guatemala isn't I think this is what happened. It's, if you care about the mathematics and the cryptography, you can prove what happened, right? There are problems upstream, but as an election auditor on election night, when I saw this, I was like, awesome, right? Like, I can't believe this happened. That I still pinch myself because it's like every time I show this to someone like you, the fact that you can see this is amazing, because we don't worry about the JPEGs changing. That's not the entire, concern of the elections, but it's a big part of it, and that's just gone. And so there are other applications within other sectors of the government that we're starting to see interest in Guatemala. Now, immediately what we are seeing is, because democracy and the voting results are, I would say, the most important public registry, right? There is no good argument to hide election results from citizens. Therefore, there's no good argument to not use this, except, of course, if you don't have the money, and for some reason Guatemala is, fantastically wealthy, and well, we're not. We're
sure.
Notoriously poor country. So, the U.S. should be able to afford this. Or, this is the biggest reason not to do this is if you're planning on committing election fraud, right? Mm-hmm. So definitely, if you're an election authority that's planning on committing election fraud, don't do this, because it's
not a good
too
idea.
Transparent. But if you know your local authority, the awesome thing about this is the statement that an election authority can send to its constituents and say, we're using this. We will stand by the data that we publish. We do not want to even have the ability to change any data, right? Can't be evil is better than don't be evil. And so we are seeing an opportunity, and we are inviting anyone to reach out to us, simpleproof.com. There's a contact form there. Unfortunately, we were canceled off of Twitter because, elections and Bitcoin just immediately get canceled off of Twitter. So we're on Nostr we're Simple Proof on Nostr. You can find our contact on simpleproof.com. And then I'm on Twitter as Carlos Toriello. But our invitation is to Bitcoiners everywhere to say, if you care about your local election, ask your election authority, do they have a plan in case everything goes wrong in November? And it's almost like you can guarantee that everything will go wrong in November. And this is just a backup plan. This is an insurance policy. This is the immutable backup, right? Of if we're attacked by hackers, if the power goes, there are all sorts of unpredictable things that if you just, if your election authority took the time to integrate this in terms of implementation, Simple Proof was contracted 4 days prior to the election, and it was still implemented. We are just now getting
the one in August, the runoff?
Actually, June. So June of last year, the contract happened 4 days prior to the election, because that's the thing, is this is simple, right? In terms of implementation, it's just making the complexity just happen in the background, and it's just a very simple integration that can be very quick. It's not expensive. Obviously, it depends on the use case in terms of how it's going to work, but it's quick to implement. And we're already getting interest in other areas in government in Guatemala, and hopefully very soon we'll have news on that. It's not just for election, though. It's any public data. But we find that because the voting system is very public, it's the easiest use case to start with. And once we can prove that this is viable in an election anywhere in the USA, then it's easier to go into other public registries, right? Where hopefully this is just the starting point. And that's why I'm also very passionate about democracy. I think I have conflicting thoughts on it, and the world today is, we could do a whole week on that. But a unique advantage that democracies have over dictatorships, monarchies, is the fact that there is this thing called the voting system, and this consensus happens, and it's this very public record. Well, citizens should be able to verify that. We should be able to don't trust, verify our election results. Being asked to just blindly trust the election results, I find problematic. And so democracies present this unique use case to get this type of use case of Bitcoin into a democracy and then expand further outward. Whereas dictatorships, they could very easily say, no, thank you. We don't want to have transparency of our public registries, right? So let's use that advantage, right? And so please, if you are passionate about creating a different touch point for people, an opportunity to educate them on Bitcoin's ability to create trust and build truth, this is a great way to, if you're like me, where uncles and aunts are like, "Are you still on that Bitcoin thing?" That's like you're still scamming people, and you're just like, in the case of Guatemala, now I can say, "Do you recall what happened with the voting system? Do you recall the massive protests?" I mean, Bitcoin is our anchor to truth in a sea of lies. And that didn't happen in my imagination or in, meme stock world or whatever you want to, say to not pay attention to this. That happened in democracy, in the National Voting Registry. And so a similar thing could happen in your community, right? Where you could be the Bitcoiner to help us get this, and help Bitcoin protect the voting system in the USA in November. And, very, very happy to work with you if you're interested.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's interesting about Bitcoin on a long enough time horizon, sometimes very quickly, as we're seeing with US presidential elections, regardless of what people think about it. And at this point, Jason Meyer was on the show to talk with me about this. We had David Bailey and Jason Meyer on the show to talk about Trump and campaigning. The Republican Party in the US and Trump is talking about Bitcoin. It is on the national stage, ingrained for better or for worse in certain political rhetoric, right? So these things are happening very, very quickly, that Bitcoin is out there. So people will use Bitcoin in those ways, but also sometimes people will get to the use cases. Like I'm sure with Simple Proof, this happening, they're like, okay, let's use this Bitcoin blockchain. You never would have dreamed this would have happened 6 months or even a year before this. So sometimes these use cases pop up or things break, and then there is a use for Bitcoin that someone maybe ideologically, right, would have been opposed to, or would have thought that's the scam thing, or that's this or that. Everyone has a way of coming around to Bitcoin. My personal belief is that Bitcoin will eat the world. It just depends on how long. There's ways we can do it to help and try to get it to people who need it most, and use cases that need it most, such as this election that you're mentioning. But I will say, in context of the US election, that is something that we've seen already quite a bit. It's always been there, here and there, but it was a very huge argument, obviously, with Donald Trump in the election. Was, okay, they were throwing ballots in the rivers, and they were doing this and they were doing that, again, just trying to call into question election integrity. I'm weary that the Democrats, and I've said a million times, I am a registered independent in the US. I have typically voted, and I am from the left and progressive and all that stuff, as everyone knows. But I think the Democrats might start to lean into that, right? They might just say, well, how do we know that we can trust the election? I'm worried that the cat is out of the bag with a lot of quote unquote election integrity in the US. We're past the days of, I'm going to trust ABC Channel 5 that we turned on and we just listened, and the next day the election was decided, or maybe a couple of days, right? I think we're in the period, in the era of post, whatever you want to call it, post trust in media, post trust in these things, which in and of itself isn't bad, right? Like we should be able to verify these things. Like you're mentioning, something like Simple Proof, we should be able to. But this November, I do worry quite a bit, regardless of what election outcome. What is going to happen? How long are we going to call into question the election? The other party might always say, well, that wasn't ever really how it happened, and that person wasn't really elected, right? Like the cat is out of the bag with that in the US, not to mention worldwide. And maybe that doesn't happen, right? But it's much more likely to happen now than before. And something like Simple Proof in the US would be a great tool. I'm just saying, I couldn't agree more.
Well, please reach out if you're interested in trying to bring this out. What I'll say is, in the case of Guatemala, we have one single national election authority. So we only had an opportunity to make this case to one group of people. And we were, you could say basically lucky in that they said yes. In the case of the US, I understand that election officials are actually, locally organized, right? So there's basically at the county clerk level, which means that there's 3,000 plus people scattered across the United States that could listen to this and could decide whether or not they think this is a good backup plan for them in case something unexpected happens. And all of a sudden they're thrust in front of the spotlight and everyone's, the cameras are all outside their door and outside their house saying, what happened? They, instead of having to come out and just, convince them because they're really good at, speaking in front of the camera, it's, hey, we published everything to Bitcoin, so let's just go check the records.
Yeah, it's out of our hands. Yeah,
check yourself. And the sooner we get in front of them, the sooner this is a not a partisan thing, right? Because I'd hate for something like just database integrity and timestamping to become partisan. So that's also why I'm very happy that you had me on, because I really hope that progressives reach out, because this is new uncharted waters. Like, no one's put a flag down here yet, right? This isn't any side.
This isn't Republican timestamping or something like that, right?
No. What I say is, like, this benefits everyone who wants truth. The only people that don't benefit from this are those that want to lie to you. And I think there are people on the right and the left that are interested in continue the lies. And this is just a way that we can benefit people that aspire and desire truth on both sides, or all sides. And so let's please reach out, because there is an opportunity here to not make this a partisan thing, right? That this is just a net benefit that is already starting to get used by neighbors. That another reason not to do this is the U.S. is okay with losing the leadership in terms of technology in the world. But because if Guatemala doing this and the U.S. not doing it means that Guatemala has somehow got an edge on the United States in terms of a specific technological use case. So I hope, and I'm been surprised at the reception from folks that have reached out, and reach out to me on Twitter, send us messages on Nostr, send us emails, like, just reach out if you, we are convinced that there has to be an election authority out there in your local county who, when hearing this, their question is going to be, well, how much is it going to cost us? And I can tell you, in the case of Guatemala, when they finally asked Simple Proof that question, and when they heard the answer, it's like, wow, it's that cheap? That's literally what they said. Like, I can't believe something this powerful is that cheap. And so it's, there's really no reason not to do this, but we do need help, right? Because, we're focused on Guatemala, and it's fantastic, and it's opening up new ground, but we are reliant on the Bitcoin network, helping us find the right people in the US to just expose them to this idea of, like, what's your backup plan, right? If everything goes wrong, like it did in Guatemala, where people are being accused of election tampering and some people might go to jail, Bitcoin is an immutable record that no one can change, is your best possible friend in that scenario. So we'd be very excited to hear from you. And again, let's not let this become a partisan issue.
Yeah, well, you left me with a lot to think about. I like to nerd out on this stuff. It's also, another funny thing to mention right before we wrap up is, these election officials, right? Especially, folks in the US, probably similar in your neck of the woods as well. These are just people that are volunteering. They're people that are walking their dogs next to you. These are not politicians running elections necessarily. You know what I mean? There's politicians that are the result of elections and get elected, but the actual people, like, casting ballots, giving you your sticker that says you voted, telling you where to walk and stand, and queuing, and all of these things. In my neck of the woods, it is one of the least partisan things in the US is the actual process of going to the ballot box and voting, even though in the United States we make everything very partisan. So that is a very intriguing. Now, I don't want to overstate it. I don't think this would be the Trojan horse to Bitcoin mass adoption as, reserve currency and all of that, right? But it does go to show and help people learn about Bitcoin, which I think I'm really passionate about. I'd rather folks learn about Bitcoin, learn about the technology and what we think is really important about it, rather than just following daily price charts and crazy YouTube videos and memes and all of these things, right? This is a very cool use case that, in the case of Guatemala, it sounded like it did something really, really fantastic for the country that felt really broken a bit with these election results, with what had happened in 2019 and even past that, where you're just like, we just want this democracy that works. We want to be able to vote. We want these things to work and not have to do all of these crazy things. It sounds like it did wonders for the nation and for people and like the soul of a nation. If you can have election integrity, that's super important.
So our voting system basically broke, but Bitcoin is like the last string that's holding it together, but it's essentially the most powerful string possible. So there are many things that contributed to protecting our voting system, but we're very proud that this was one of them. And it did push folks that were just like you mentioned, just your neighbor who just likes to volunteer and do this. It's providing that new touch point and making it easier than to say, well, then let me talk to you about Bitcoin as a better savings technology for you. And so it just pierces the FUD that has kind of very heavily been encapsulated around people's heads, where I think it's great that it should be expected that people resist the sound money arguments because you're talking about money, right? But here we're just talking about Bitcoin as a database, right? The most distributed, most powerful database the world has ever seen. And so that's a good place to start. And definitely for me, one of the main reasons I'm doing this is because it creates that touch point for hundreds of thousands of people, where obviously it's not like we hyper Bitcoinized the day after as a result, but the barriers to entry are lower. So folks are just less guarded and more open to it because, and not just my neighbor or my uncle, it's literally the president and his congressmen and judges. So it's people know about this now. They can't just write it off as, I heard that criminals are using it. It's like, no. This is a part of our democratic system, and you can't just hand wave that away, right? Like now it's a topic of discussion, and hopefully soon all of our government records will be timestamped to Bitcoin, so that Guatemala may be the first country in the world where once a document is issued by the state, it can never disappear. And we are very excited to build that future and hope to bring it to the whole world.
That's brilliant. This is so cool. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for doing this. People, please explore Simple Proof. If you really have ideas, like at the local level, a lot of our listeners are very involved in their local communities and with their local, congressmen, senators, even just city officials around Bitcoin, and sending them articles and things like that. So folks that do that, definitely do that with Simple Proof as well. Get in touch with Carlos, get in touch with myself if you have thoughts around that or want other connections. But definitely reach out in regards to this, dig into this topic. I think it's, you explained it really, I think, eloquently and really well, but I think it's also a lot to dig into once you start thinking about the other use cases here with it. So it's really cool. So people sit with it, talk to your friends about it as another use case for Bitcoin. But Carlos, anything else before we jump off? I know there's a million other things. I feel like we're gonna have to do another episode probably before the election. I'd honestly really like to do that because there's a lot more that I'm going to think about and ping you for sure. But anything else for today?
Add to visit not only simpleproof.com, but we have a demo called demo.simpleproof.com where you can try you can try this yourself. And if you're running your own node, you can verify this yourself with your own node. And so we are trying to make it as simple as possible to show the power of this. And it's one of those odd things that, Satoshi talked about this back in, early 2010s from the beginning. Like this is just going back to the OG, secondary application of Bitcoin. And yet, it's 2024 and there's not a whole lot of timestamping going on outside of the Bitcoiner circles. And in this next decade, AI will make truth just kind of even harder to find, right? So my conviction is Bitcoin is an anchor of truth in a sea of lies. And if we help our neighbors with that, and provide them this shield against the chaos and madness out there in the world, that people won't forget that. So reach out, simpleproof.com, and my name, I'm also known as Carlinho. So if you hear that name, it's probably me. And just thanks for your time and take care.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Carlos. We'll definitely talk again soon.